you just do it, it'll turn out okay. And today has been a hell of a day of stuff I did.
You look pretty worn out.
I rode my bike 26 miles.
You said on Dapper's stream.
Yes, but if it was just that, I mean, that would be exhausting enough, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But I got a late start doing it. I was gonna do it in the early morning before it got too hot. I mean, lucky it was in the 70s today. But I started it was in this final start was in the 60s. But yeah, that got delayed from 8 a.m. to about 11 a.m. Then for like a say about half a mile of a bike trail, I had to go on a mile and a half detour on my bike. Then when I got there, the original plan was to catch a ride back,
Mm-hmm.
but then that plan changed, so I had to rest up. Went to Panera's, charged my phone, rested up a bit, and then took the 13 miles back to where I started. I was gonna ride the bus from my downtown to where I live. Missed that bus by like 5 minutes, so I had to catch the next bus, which only makes it halfway
Mm-hmm.
to the thing to work to just like a Walmart in my down my area. Then I had to go the rest of the from like maybe about another mile trip, give or take, from there to back home. And I just got here like literally 20 minutes ago.
Jeez.
And then like I said, I left on the same time this morning, so I got 12 hours. It was gonna be like a quick, maybe 2 hour bike ride turned into a 12-hour experience.
Jeez.
But today we're talking about my troubles. We're here to talk about the American troubles of the 1800s.
That was a heck of a segue.
All right, fast. Get a sponsor up here. I logo and now you have to have the archives on you.
Mm-hmm.
The screen share. You had the stuff on decoration on you. You can
Yeah,
screen share.
I've got my my avatar up, but um,
Uh,
hold on.
you screen. Okay.
What are what are we talking here?
It's be the button, third button on down here. It says share screen.
Oh yeah. Um. What
If
I
not, I can. If not, I can find. I can go online and find a copy.
I've got actually I've got the Wikipedia page up on my computer because that was handy.
Okay.
Just to consult onto. Um, let's see here. Are you not gonna just let me fine? You're just not gonna let me switch. So you're gonna have to. There we go. There is my Wikipedia page.
Awesome.
So
All right. So let's go. Where did all this come from? Where did this come from? Why? Why did we do it?
so the history of the United States as you know European colonies was well over 150 years old at this point. Plymouth is 1620, but Plymouth wasn't the first British colony, which wasn't even the first colony in what is now the United States. The first permanent colony in what is now the United States that is still being um, It's still populated and has been continuously a city that whole time, is St. Augustine, Florida. But that was Spanish, so it's not really relevant to the
We don't count that because we're not Spanish. Florida might count it.
Yeah, Florida is very, very proud of St. Augustine, and rightfully so, but they're not relevant to the Declaration.
Ours was it Jamestown then for us?
Yeah, Jamestown, 1603, or not 1603.
7.
1607, yeah, which is just barely into the reign of James the First. There's a reason that the first the first territory is called Virginia, but the first city is called Jamestown.
Yeah, Virginia is for the former leader whose colonies didn't work out very well.
Yeah, Roanoke. Roanoke is its own whole thing, but they tried, and one of the reasons the Roanoke colony failed was when the governor went back to try to get more assistance, ships were being borrowed from everywhere for the attack of the Spanish Armada. So that's 1588. So we're talking nearly 200 years before the Declaration of Independence. And for most, there's a lot of colonial history, but for most of that time, contrary to what a lot of people think, the colonists kind of went along as if what was going on in England didn't 100% matter.
Out of mind, out of sight, out of mind.
Basically, yeah, like, what are they going to do about it? Seems to have been the prevailing attitude. Because it was a long, treacherous journey by ship across the Atlantic. And nobody important ever took that journey, because why?
Yeah, I guess after us, they started paying more attention to their colonies.
Yeah. Well, the thing is they were starting to pay more attention to their colonies, starting with what in the United States is called the French and Indian War.
Or what's called in Europe the 7-Year War.
Right. French and Indian War is actually a really bad name for it because it sounds like the French and the Indians were fighting, they were, but they were fighting against the British.
Yeah, it's weird. I learned a lot of what we had in your names over there had different names over here, like the Queen Anne War, all that stuff was like the Spanish Succession War over there, and all these different successions. And we're like, what's called the war that the name of our current monarch?
Yeah, well, and that's not just the stuff that happened before independence, because all of the battles of the Civil War have different names depending on whether you're in the North or the South. So, it's like, well, is it Bull Run, or I believe it's Manassas is the Southern name for it. And apparently the one side tended to name the battles after towns, and the other tended to name the battles after waterways.
Yeah,
and so that's why you got. Yeah,
we can talk about that failed case of independence at another time.
Oh yes, but yeah, and the documents of attempted secession are interesting and really put the lie to the whole "it wasn't really slavery" thing. But about the time of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the British royalty started realizing, the British government started realizing that colonies could have an influence on how things played out in Europe. And they started taking a much more direct role in how things were governed in the Americas.
Well, after that war, that they got their hands on Canada, India, what's other important things.
Well, Canada except for Quebec.
Oh, Well, I
I
thought
mean,
Quebec was the thing they got because Quebec was the only thing
Quebec is its own thing that I would argue even Quebec doesn't really control. But Quebec was French, but a lot of the rest of Canada had already been British, and actually, the Basque had been fishing off the coast of Nova Scotia since before Columbus. So Canada is its own really complicated thing that I'm not as much up on because I'm not Canadian. But so they not only did the English government start sending more troops just on a regular basis as sort of a, hey, we should have these here in case we need them kind of thing. But the idea came that, hey, maybe the Americans should be paying for some of this. And the Americans were like, hey, how about you let us have a voice in Parliament before you make us pay taxes?
I wonder what happened if they actually got if each state got their own parliament, at least one parliament seat.
It probably would have only delayed, because I mean, even Canada eventually split from the UK, but it also would have helped them hold on to some of their other colonies for longer too, because that became a real thing with the other colonies. Was like, wait a minute, we don't have representation either.
Of course, even though Canada split, they still considered they're still connected.
I mean, the Commonwealth is a whole thing, and I've been in the it's not a parliament because it's unicameral. I forget what it's called, but the legislature building in Victoria, British Columbia, and they had, at the time I was there, which was some years ago, obviously, a very large portrait of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, because technically she is still their monarch. But and let's be clear, independence was an elite movement in the colonies.
The commerce didn't care that much either way.
Well, yeah, they didn't have time. If all you were doing was subsistence farming, it kind of didn't matter whether you were subsistence farming under the British Crown or your own new, freely elected government. Your life wasn't going to change all that much either way. And of course, as we'll discuss as this goes on, if you were a slave, yeah, it mattered even less, except for the part where during the Revolution, the British were offering freedom to slaves who fought for them. And the Americans weren't. Because the American slave-owning aristocracy was very prominent in the Continental Congress.
Fun times.
Yeah. John Adams had feelings on the subject.
Yeah. So first, I guess we tried the diplomatic approach. That didn't work.
Yeah. We tried the diplomatic approach repeatedly. And actually, it's interesting to note that Benjamin Franklin was, for a while, fairly strongly opposed to independence, in part because he had been in London on behalf of the Continental Congress and didn't really have a feeling of how things were going back in the colonies. And so he was still convinced that reconciliation could work. Until he came back and it was like, oh, no, I guess it can't. And by the time the Congress met to discuss independence, the Revolutionary War had already started.
Yeah, this was after the second Congress at this point.
Yeah, this is after Lexington and Concord. This is, George Washington was off leading an army at the time.
Okay, so he already got he's already in charge by then.
He's already in charge by the time all of this starts. After having spent a fair amount of time during the first Congress sitting around in his uniform from the French and Indian War to remind everyone that he had experience as a soldier, so they might maybe want to consider putting him in charge. You know, we discussed when we went over the Constitution how reluctant Washington had been to become president. He was not reluctant to take over the army. He wanted to take over the army.
Well, at least in America, military leadership and political leadership are two different issues.
Yes.
At least it should be.
And so the issue is, and I'll confess here that I haven't seen Hamilton, but what I have seen a bunch of times is 1776. And I don't know if you've seen that one. But that is that's a musical so old that the movie was shaped by the politics of Richard Nixon. About the Declaration, and it doesn't get everything right, but one of the things it does get right is that the idea of the Declaration was a controversial one even within Congress. I've seen estimates, and Lord, I don't know how they came by these statistics, but I've seen estimates that 1/3 of the colonial population at the time actually supported independence. 1/3 supported staying with with Great Britain, and 1/3 did not care and just wanted the war to end and everything to just
sounds American to me.
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense because, again, for a lot of these people, their lives were not going to substantially change. You know, they might have slightly better say over their laws, but only slightly, given that even with independence, it was still considered that only white male property owners were going to make any laws at all. Were going to even be allowed to vote. So if you weren't a white male property owner, hard to imagine you cared very much who was making the rules.
Yep.
The answer was not you.
This is why most of them couldn't vote for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the number of people in this country eligible to vote has been on a slow upward progression the entire time we've been a country.
And we've gone through several of those things in our amendment talk.
And there are some that we didn't even get to, such as things like, you know, the idea that you didn't have to own property.
Yeah, as long as you're a male and
right.
And white.
If you're a white dude, you can still vote whether or not you have property. And, you know, with the Chinese Exclusionary Act and other laws of that kind in the 20th century, if you were a Chinese immigrant, you were never going to be able to vote because you couldn't become a citizen. It was illegal. So by abolishing that law, which did not take an amendment, that increased the number of people who were now suddenly eligible to become eligible to vote. So most of the country didn't really care, but a handful of elite guys met in Philadelphia in what was apparently a very hot summer to talk about, can we fix it or do we have to break away?
Funny story, real fast.
Mm-hmm.
You originally talked to me about doing this on the 3rd, but
mm-hmm.
but planned. Otherwise, I had to wait till September 9th.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, contrary to our mental image of it, did not sign on July the 4th. They straggled in over months.
It's almost like transportation was an issue back then.
It's a bit like, yeah. That is one of the things 1776 does get wrong. It ends on this big dramatic moment of these guys getting up one at a time, and that's not how it happened.
And
that's not even close to how it happened.
And the guy doing this big 20-point font.
Yeah. Oh, John Hancock's signature is really huge on it. And the joke has always been that it was so that George could read it without his glasses. It's much more likely that he was just the first person to sign. He had the most room. He was the president of the Continental Congress, so he was the first one to sign. Everybody else had to cram their signatures in, and he didn't have to worry about it.
Now, was there more than one writer or an editor?
Yeah, there was originally a 5-person committee. What it was it had been said that in order for the Declaration to be ratified, it had to be unanimous. No state was colony, still colonies at the time, no colony was going to be cut away from England without its consent. And they could not get a unanimous vote, and they knew it. And so they said, okay, well, let us have a written document explaining exactly what our problem is and why we feel we need to dissolve these ties. And so they appointed a 5-person committee. And I have to confess, I can only off the top of my head remember 3 of the people in it, but 3 of the people in it were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, so you don't really need to remember the other 2 guys, because they weren't that important.
A lot of people only don't even remember the 2 of those guys.
Right, exactly. Well, and it really was something that John Adams said at Thomas Jefferson's funeral, was that when it came time to remember the whole revolution, nobody was going to remember him. Nobody was going to remember most of the people. They were going to remember Ben Franklin and George Washington. And what they would remember was that Ben Franklin struck the ground with his lightning rod, and George Washington sprung fully formed from the ground on his horse, and then won the battle all by himself.
So you said when John Adams at his funeral, Thomas Jefferson's funeral, it was like 2 hours before his own funeral.
It was Ben Franklin's funeral.
Oh, okay.
No, Ben Franklin's funeral.
Okay, I thought it was like Thomas. No. They died the same day.
They did die the same day. No, Ben Franklin died a bit before them. He was the oldest member of the Congress at the time. He was in his 70s.
Yeah, he died right after the Constitution got ratified.
He was not a young man, and he was old and tired and had gout. And one of his children, he had an illegitimate son who his way of rebelling against his father was being the royal governor of the state of New Jersey.
Inside of the British.
Yeah. And he was actually captured and imprisoned around the time of the Declaration of Independence. It should be said that they hadn't spoken to one another for some time at that point, and that Franklin didn't entirely care. Not a loving family, but it was agreed that for a lot of reasons, it had to be a Southerner writing the Declaration. A lot of what's going on behind the scenes is we have to involve the Southerners, and in particular, we have to involve Virginia.
Because at this point, most of the stuff had been happening up north, like Massachusetts and stuff, and Rhode Island and all.
Yeah, well, it's partially that most of the battles were happening in the north, but it's also that most of the money was in the south.
Well, I meant, well, Well, yeah, but the battles too. But the Boston Tea Party, the Boston
Yeah,
Massacre, all that.
a lot of the stuff leading into the revolution was northern, but the money that basically the country was strongly influenced by the southern aristocracy.
The slave money.
Well, the slave money, but wealthy, educated men, who were farmers. The northerners were tradesmen and they were lawyers. And there was still that kind of looking down on tradesmen and looking down on anyone who worked for a living. So even small independent farmers were not as important as rich slave owning farmers who didn't have to do their own work. So there was a lot of that going on. So they knew that they needed to include the South. And Virginia was the best regarded part of the South.
The Carolinas and Georgia, or not yet.
Yeah, well, the Carolinas were fairly wealthy on the coasts. Georgia was not a lot. Georgia was still probably the poorest of the southern states.
What started as not a slave state, prison state.
It had started, unlike the other colonies, it had literally started as a prison colony. So Georgia was not very highly regarded at the time, but Virginia, the first permanent British settlement, the first British settlement was in Virginia. There was a lot of Virginia is really important. All of this stuff happened in Virginia. So they had to include a Virginian. And Thomas Jefferson was known to be a good writer.
And drew the lucky straw.
Well, he didn't really think so. He kind of got drafted. But he was given really very little time to produce the document because, the war was already going on and they kind of needed to get everything settled as quickly as possible. And he's still a working member of Congress at the time. So finally, he produces the document and he brings it forward and they rip it to shreds. Everybody had something to complain about in this document as presented. The biggest struggle was Jefferson blamed King George III for the slave trade, which is ludicrous on so many levels.
Since it was happening way before
it was happening. The first slaves were brought to the New World from Africa to Jamestown.
Like 16, was it 1619?
Yes, thereabouts. And Native Americans had been enslaved. The two reasons they didn't just stick to keeping Native Americans as slaves were, number one, it was far too easy for them to get away clean if they escaped.
Because they know the territory. They've been there for a while.
Right. Well, and also they could just go to other Native Americans who would help them get away.
That too.
And they died too quickly because they didn't have resistance to old world illnesses. So native slaves were much more likely to, say, die of measles and die of smallpox. And African slaves had more resistance to that.
At least the ones that were in the sugar mines.
Well, if you were working in the sugar fields, then you weren't dying from measles or smallpox. You were dying from exhaustion and possibly malaria.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that's the one. Anything positive about it is there was less turnover in the American northern colonies, I guess, because
yeah,
they weren't dying on their first trip. like I think they said like 90% of the 95% of the transport went to Brazil and the Caribbean, while only like 5% went to Americas.
Yeah. Slavery in Brazil and the Caribbean was brutal, in part from climate, in part from the kind of work that you were doing, and so many slaves just died
Of
that it
course,
was constant attempting to keep the replacement rate up.
of course, the bad part about that is they appear they lived long. The bad part is they lived long enough to have kids, and
Yeah.
so that was
Yeah.
negative up here because hey, your kids are slaves too now. Grats.
Yeah. No, it's, and a lot of the founding fathers, and believe me, the British were not averse to pointing out the hypocrisy involved here. A lot of the founding fathers were slave owners. Now, one of them, after signing the Declaration, released his slave because he couldn't, and apparently he only had the one, because he couldn't continue to own a human being while fighting for the rights of human beings to be free. So good on him, and Ben Franklin started an anti-slavery society. The first anti-slavery society in the United States was founded by Ben Franklin. And there were abolitionist, or what would later be called abolitionist, signers of the Declaration, but most of them were neutral to, wow, you own a lot of slaves on
Yeah,
the
and
subject.
of course you probably. I'm not saying this for a fact, but probably a lot of even at this time the anti-slavery people weren't like let's give black people rights too. This freedom.
Yeah. It was not, we're going to free you and make you equal to white people. It's, we're going to free you and
Whatever.
figure out what we do then. Yeah. So, you know, so he put this line in and ended up with the choice of either you take out the line about slavery or the South will not sign this document. And the line got omitted. And the thing is they didn't put this line in 1776 because they thought it was too on the nose. But John Adams said, I think it was John Adams, it might have been Franklin, said that by ignoring the issue of slavery, in 80 years' time, it would be something their grandchildren would curse them for.
Yeah. Well, a lot.
Now,
Well,
what
I
is
guess
what does 80 years work out to?
about 1860.
That's 40 years.
Yeah, like I said, of course, not just this. A lot of the things was like this, the 1820 thing, the 1850 thing was all just kicking
Yeah.
down, just like not my
Yeah.
problem. Kick down the road a little bit.
Yeah. And in this case, several of the people knew that they could not kick it down the road forever. And several of the people thought that it wasn't a problem, so who cared if they were kicking it down the road? But not only did John Adams know that kicking it down the road was a problem that was not going to fix things, but he managed to predict almost to the year how long it would take before everything blew up.
Kind of,
which is amazing.
kind of like that happened. I think it happened several times in history. Like one with the Hinden, Hindenburg, the Bismarck guy.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much predicting World War One at the
Yeah.
time, and then same thing maybe 20 years after World War One, almost predicting World War Two.
Yeah, well, and there was I forget which branch of the service he was. There was a guy named Billy Mitchell who was convinced that air power was going to be really, really important
Oh yeah,
in World War II.
I remember that. Like airplanes won't be important. Like whatever. Go.
He actually got court-martialed for his insistence that they needed to think about airplanes and how airplanes could be used against the United States. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and they all went, oh.
Like, but at that point, well, at least some bombing, most planes were dogfight planes. Like that.
Yeah.
What are they gonna do? Fire on the ground from up there? Silly guy.
Yeah. So, before you can even get into what it says, there's a lot of background about, yes, these people were absolutely the elites of the country. No, not everyone in the country cared. Yes, slavery is a thing that they were deliberately not talking about in this specific document. And it was voted on July 2nd, was the day that John Adams thought should be the holiday, and officially ratified on July 4th.
Now, sorry. A lot of people, I think, don't even know about the preamble part. They always get the second part.
Yeah. The introduction is actually, I learned it from Ben and Me, which is a Disney cartoon.
Nice.
About Benjamin Franklin and the mouse who worked for him.
Was it Mickey Mouse's ancestor?
No, they're drawn in completely different styles. But it's a cute cartoon. It's really adorable. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. I believe Jefferson's original draft didn't mention God, and somebody got kind of annoyed at him about that, and so they inserted the God bit.
Yeah. Take out the slaves, put in the God.
Right. That's, yeah. But it's basically like, look, we tried. We are in our rights to do this. Our rights don't come from the law. Our rights come from the world, the universe. We have these rights from laws that no human controls. Is basically what this is saying. But we also need to explain what we're doing here. Because if we're going to claim that we have these rights without saying why we have them, we look like whiny little crybabies. It's also worth noting that most Americans at the time weren't paying taxes because one of the biggest industries in the colonies was smuggling.
Yeah. Of course,
but,
were taxes more like called tariffs back then?
Well, no. Oh. No, tariffs are, duties paid for import and export. And these were direct taxes. These were payable when you bought the thing.
All right.
There was a thing called the Stamp Act, which basically said that anything you bought that was printed, you had to pay to have a stamp put on it to show that you had paid the taxes on it. And that was newspapers, that was playing cards, that was books, that was everything. And the tax on tea. You bought tea, you had to pay this tax, which was then payable to the crown, to whatever. And most people were not officially buying tea. They were buying smuggled tea.
And sugar and all this other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Various of the founding fathers made a living through smuggling. Whatever their official job title was, they were smugglers. But it wasn't the taxes themselves, it was the belief that nobody should be able to tell them that they have to pay these taxes that they're not going to pay anyway. And there were a lot of other factors going in. The tax thing makes an easy talking point, But we talked when we went over the amendments about the whole quartering soldiers thing. People were being forced to let soldiers stay in their homes for free. And nobody wants to do that. That sucks. That's not fair.
It's like when an RP character goes into your house and breaks your pot and steals all your rest and stuff.
Exactly. It's like that's not okay. And I've actually played video games where you try to open people's doors and things, and the characters yell at you and say, "Who do you think you are?" And I appreciate that. And the soldiers were actually required to get jobs because they weren't really being paid enough. So in order to survive, they had to get jobs, and that was really damaging the job market in the colonies, anywhere where soldiers were being kept. So there were a lot of factors involved, but they only had to work with what they had. And no taxation without representation is a nice pithy rallying cry, which is why it's still on Washington, D.C. license plates. Which is also Washington, D.C. being really passive-aggressive.
Yeah, a lot there, a lot of supporters of our ex-president.
Yeah. So then we get to the preamble, which is the part that people actually know.
The one people can almost recite by memory at this point.
Yep. We hold these truths to be self-evident, which is, you don't need to prove this. It's something that proves itself just when you say it. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not happiness. You're not entitled to that, but you're entitled to do what you want within reason, if that makes you happy. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. You get a government, but if the government isn't doing what it should to make sure that you can have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, you can either change the government or start over. The change part is built right in from the beginning. There are a lot of people who need to recognize that. Some of them may be on our Supreme Court. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing forms to which they are accustomed. It's easier to go along with things than to change them.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, that's a pretty accurate summation of the human experience right there. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Like, when you've had enough, it is your obligation to fix it and to make it right.
And they had enough at this point.
And they had enough at this point. And yeah, there's some skillful propaganda involved in getting them to the point where they'd had enough. A deep dive into the Boston Massacre is fascinating stuff because it did not happen the way most Americans think it did. The Boston Tea Party didn't happen the way most Americans thought it did.
Yeah, I learned a lot of stuff like I think John Adams defended the
Yeah.
shooters.
John Adams defended the soldiers in court, in part because he believed that everyone was entitled to a defense, but also because they were provoked. Nobody knew who ordered them to fire, and they were scared as hell. And he got them off, too. A jury of Americans, because the trial was in Boston. A jury of Americans found the soldiers not guilty. So, there was propaganda involved in getting the colonies to the revolution point, but they were also being oppressed. So it is what it is. And we get the Bill of Grievances, which gives you a really interesting insight into 18th century Americas. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then the wording there is important because they are not saying this is for the king. This is for Parliament. They're saying this is for everyone. We are showing this to everyone. Because it is no longer just between us and the king, us and Parliament. We want the world's opinion on what we're doing. In part because, frankly, we would not have won the Revolutionary War without a strong ally.
Talking about the French?
The French. We would not have won between the French and Van Steuben, who came from Germany and actually got the colonial army on something of a professional basis, and a handful of other Europeans, we would have lost.
Yeah, I hope they turned out okay. I don't know what happened to the French after the revolution over here a few years later.
Well, they spent a lot of money on our revolution and decided that the way to get it was not by taxing people who had money, but by taxing the poor people.
Well, it's funny. The 7 years / French Indian War led to the American Revolution. The American Revolution led to the French Revolution.
Which then led to the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, wars are just a never-ending series of dominoes. But the whole thing about how they tax the poor instead of the rich gives some of us a something condemned to repeat it something kind of feeling. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, which was they felt he wasn't doing his job. He wasn't. When they passed laws, he wasn't allowing them to be enforced without, Parliament deciding that they were a good idea. The colonies couldn't govern themselves. He has forbidden, here we go. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. So if, let's say, New Hampshire passes a law in their own government, in the colony, saying, public houses have to require employees to wash their hands, which they wouldn't have, but it's a fairly benign law. The benefits of hand washing weren't known yet, but let's say that they had somehow decided to pass that law. That law could not go into effect unless George III approved it. And he wasn't doing that. They'd send it back to England, and there things would stay.
Of course, at this, of course, I don't know. At this point, did King George even have any power? At this point,
It's complicated. He didn't have as much power as his ancestors had had. Before Charles the First, who, it's worth noting, yes, the current British royal family is German, but yes, they are also descended from Charles the First through his second son, James.
Yeah, I the whole family tree thing about that.
Yeah.
Of course, technically, the current royal family is also descended from Charles the First's father, James the First.
Yes. They are descended from James, James, Charles the First, and then James the Second.
Why meant on the other side, James's granddaughter was.
Oh, yes. And then if William takes the throne, he's actually descended from Charles II, which no monarch of England ever has been, because Charles had no legitimate children.
Through his mom?
Through his mom. His mom is descended from, I think, 2 of Charles's illegitimate children.
Yeah. So this Stuart family makes its return to Britain after they're like, you're too Catholic. Let's go with the German.
Yeah.
They're German, but they're Protestant, so they're kings now.
Camilla is descended from a different one of the illegitimate children. He had a lot of illegitimate children. Historically, I don't tend to put the blame for queens when they don't have children, except in the case of Charles II's wife. It is quite clear that he was capable of having children.
Too bad none of them was with his wife.
Yeah, well. So, they would be passing these laws, and they would just sit there, and nothing would happen. And so George didn't have as much power as James had, as Charles I had tried to have, because of the whole Parliament Oliver Cromwell beheading thing.
Yeah, after that, and then the combining Scotland and Scotland and England into Britain.
Yeah, but George still had more power than Victoria would. The power of the throne was very much in flux at this point. And at the very least, he was still in control of the colonies. That was in his direct authority. He had to put his signature on these laws, and he wasn't doing it. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. As I recall, they wanted more territories. They wanted to establish more territories, more colonies.
West of the Appalachians.
Yes, but George wouldn't allow colonies that didn't have in their charters that they were subservient to Parliament and to the king. So he would not allow them to be self-governing.
Yeah, I think the plan was, if even after that first, was just make the state go westward, like extend Virginia or Carolinas or whatever to the west.
Officially, the borders of a lot of the early colonies extend to the Pacific Ocean, according to their charters. In practical terms, no, they didn't.
Yeah. So right now I live in Ohio, so technically I live in Pennsylvania, second edition.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where Olympia would be under those rules, because I'd have to look at a map and draw lines and things. But yeah, technically, I'm in one of the original 13 colonies too, by their original charters. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. So the governor would be able to, the governor of Virginia would be able to say, okay, well, we're having our meeting this place now. Or, the governor of New York could say, I think the state capital was actually in New York City at the time, and would be able to say, well, we're going to have it in Niagara Falls this week.
Of course.
Because I felt like it.
Of course, at this point, too, we weren't technically a country yet. We were still several colonies or states working together.
Yeah. Well, working at not quite completely cross purposes a fair amount of the time. Let's be real.
And we'll talk about that more in our next episode in a month or two.
Yeah. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness of his invasions on the rights of the people. I love the phrasing on this one. The manly firmness. Which is basically, he'd dissolve, if he was mad at the Virginia House of Commons, he would dissolve it. And say, yeah, you don't exist anymore. Because you've made me mad. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. With no government, if they were invaded by the French, the Spanish, Native Americans trying to get their land back, whoever, or if there were, let's be real, he's probably talking about slave revolts, though revolts of white people were not unheard of either. There was nothing the state could do about that, the colony could do about that, after its legislature had been dissolved. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. It was immigration issues. He could say, no, you can't have German people. More Americans are descended from Germans than any other European ethnicity. No Spanish people, no French people. Let's not even talk of people from places other than that. And, you want to have the Polish encourage their people who are looking for farms to come and farm in your state. Yeah, you can't do that. So he was, let's go with, instead of blaming George personally, the British government was deliberately keeping the population of the colonies low as best they could to prevent the colonies from having the power to do anything about it.
Yeah, well, I guess to British commoners, we're just foreign Americans, whatever.
Yeah, well, I do have some British blood, but I also have a lot from a lot of other places. Found out recently my great-grandmother was Slovakian.
Nice.
Well,
I know about my blood, but my adopted family was Scottish.
Yeah. Well, my great-grandmother was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I knew as a kid she was born in Czechoslovakia, and then that country stopped existing too.
Yeah.
So,
as far as I doubt it, but as far as I know, my adopted ancestors might be one of the illegitimate kids of Charles I. Because
I mean, really, who among us is not descended from an illegitimate child of Charles II? And the answer is the current royal family. Like Charles III is not descended. But let's see. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. They couldn't have new judges. When they wanted a new courthouse in a new town, that had to go through the British government. And they weren't being allowed to do that.
and it's not like this time they can call the phone and ask permission. They okay, write a letter, send the ship there.
Send the ship there.
Wait to that, and then send the ship back with the yes or no.
And a lot of the time, it was literally just wait because they didn't do anything either way. You'd wait 3 years and get an answer of no. So then you'd have to go through the whole process all over again. Like, these are legitimate grievances, a lot of these. I tease, but a lot of what's going on, in part because of the communication issues, is just not tenable. It is not possible to run a country, to run any area without being able to set your own judges, which is the next one we get to. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. The British government in London is appointing judges and setting their salaries. And I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that very few people in London knew what the cost of living was in Charleston, South Carolina at the time. So, was the judge being paid enough? Was he being paid too much? Nobody in authority to set the cost of, the salary had any idea. It was a real problem. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Tax collectors. There were a lot of civil servants who were controlling aspects of American life. Well, they couldn't get the things they did want help with dealt with. They were getting civil servants.
Is that where we get the tar and feather thing?
Yeah, well. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. No quartering soldiers. And in many ways, they were being treated like an occupied territory.
And, well, before they were like, we're British citizens too.
Yeah. There's a line in 1776 that it's a lot of the lines in 1776 are accurate, but not all of them. And so it's like, well, somebody says it, but I don't remember if this is one of the real ones or not. But Franklin is asked what's the problem with being given the honor of being called an Englishman? And he says it's like an ox being called a bull. He appreciates the honor, but he'd rather have the entitlements. Because, of course, oxen are castrated. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. The fact that the Boston Massacre is the only time I know of where American soldiers were tried, where British soldiers were tried for crimes against American citizens. The military was in charge. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving him his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. I believe this is the one that refers to the Scottish mercenaries. Mm-hmm. But, yeah. for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Because, I talk about how the Boston Massacre didn't happen the way people think it did, and those people were provoked, and so on and so on. But that doesn't mean there weren't real instances of soldiers killing American citizens in what was...
That was just the most public part of it.
Yeah. And a lot of the other ones were not provoked and were not the same kind of situation at all. And a lot of other soldiers didn't suffer anything for it because George didn't make them. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, the Americans were only supposed to trade with the British. By British law, the colonies could only trade with the British. And here was another fact about that. They weren't supposed to be manufacturers themselves. They were supposed to create raw materials, which would then be sent to England, where English factories would produce goods, which would then be sent back to the Americas to be sold.
Yeah. You can have your cotton shirt in a year or two.
Yeah. With, a lot of the price of it going to line the pockets of English factory owners. Because the finished shirt is going to cost you more than the raw cotton cost the British. Because you can't even make the yarn. You have to send it back as cotton. So a British factory is going to make the yarn, and then a British factory is going to make the yarn into cloth, and then a British factory is going to make the cloth into a shirt. And all three of those factories are going to take their cut. And you're going to pay them for the privilege of having waited 2 years.
Oh, don't forget the dyeing. The dyeing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the dyeing, too. Let's not forget them. So 4 British factories. Yeah. And you can't go to a French company that...
But don't worry. They're gonna use that money... That the British will use that money to go down to Africa to get more slaves for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, that's another one where it's like, yeah, when you listen to what their actual grievances are, some of them are seriously legitimate. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. And whether or not they paid the taxes, it is true that they didn't have any say in them. For depriving us, in many cases, of the benefit of trial by jury. And this leads to one of the 1776 is a very funny musical, but to me, one of the funniest moments is when they are picking the first draft of the Declaration to bits. And one of the guys says that in his colony, they've never been deprived of trial by jury. And John Adams is like, well, in Massachusetts we have. And he says, well, can we just add in many cases? And one of the other members of the Congress just is like, you're going to tell your grandchildren that you got that phrase put in there, aren't you? You must be so proud. But it is, there were people who were just thrown in trial or thrown in jail because, as I said when we covered the amendments, when you look at the Bill of Rights, you can see what the big issues under the English were. And a lot of them deal with courts. Because the colonies were not protected in the courts the way they felt they should be. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. This is why you have to be tried in the place where the crime took place in the US, unless you go through a lengthy process. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing, I think this is Canada, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies.
Back when we thought Canada or Quebec, whatever it was, might be the 14th colony.
Yeah. They were like, "Yep, they're just trying to make Canada into what they want us to be, and you can't fool us about Canada." For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. So, during the reign of Charles II, obviously we're going back a bit for this one, um, they asked to have the original charter sent back so that the king could review it. And the people in Massachusetts were like, "You can't fool us." Like, "No, I don't think we'll be doing that." And they were like, "We lost it." And it's still in Boston. But the crown was repealing charters and replacing them when there were terms in the charter that they didn't like. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Again, just, you can't have your government, we're in charge now. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Like I said, the war was already going at this point. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Yeah. They were at war. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries, that's the Scots and some Germans, to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. That is, to put it charitably, an exaggeration of how the war was going at the time. But it is true that, they hired mercenaries. And that, a state of war did exist. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. If your ship was stopped by a British naval vessel and the British naval vessel needed people, they had the legal right to take anyone they wanted off that ship. And you were in the Navy now. And because they didn't consider the Americas to not be British, that included Americans. It's actually one of the causes of the War of 1812, is they were still doing that in 1812. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And if you read the history of the colonies, calling the natives in merciless savages is a take. In every state of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And there it is. Like, look, here's a list of complaints we have. Some of them are exaggerated, but a lot of them are real grievances that you can document through history. Like, yes, this refers to this thing, this refers, what have you. And we don't have any other way of making our case known except by revolution. So here we are, which then goes to the failed warnings. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity, which is basically Parliament isn't listening to us either. And that was also true. You there?
Yeah.
Okay. So then, denunciation. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. Like, if anybody else tried to pull this crap, we would be their enemy too. Since it's you, that doesn't change anything. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, the first time that term was ever used, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world, which is, let's talk about God again, for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
And then the signatures.
And then the signatures. And I have to tell you, I get chills reading the conclusion.
Real fast, I know something. We'll be back next episode, but I like how they said the states, not the country, the states.
Yeah, the states. The thing is, they all knew they couldn't survive alone. If they had tried to establish 13 individual countries, they'd have been snapped up by France and Spain and whoever all within 10 years. They needed each other. And so they are states. They are connected.
But at this point, they don't want to have too much together power. We work together, but we're still our own thing.
Yeah, they're doing what in early childhood education is referred to as parallel play. They're not playing together, they're playing next to each other in a social kind of way.
But we'll talk more about that in our next episode.
Yes.
So, and there it is. And I heard, I don't know if it's a myth or not, or rumors, that once these people signed this stuff, they had to win or else because their names were on the document.
Yeah. One of the quotes is, if we do not hang together, we will surely all hang separately. And again, this is another 1776 one, which is, they're all standing around making all of these jokes about things, and one of them is saying that, he's so fat that he'll drop right away, but this other guy is so skinny that he'll be dancing long after the other guy is gone. And John Hancock, and this one is definitely from the musical and not from reality, because we know how long the signatory process took. But John Hancock was like, this is all very funny, guys, but if the redcoats burst in here right now, my name is still the only one on the damn thing. This was the term, stemming from Julius Caesar's, this is the crossing of the Rubicon. This is the minute where you win or you die. These are the choices these men had. And, fortunately for them, they won. But, there's this belief that their lives were all devastated by the signing. And that is just ridiculously untrue, leaving aside that there were 2 presidents in the room. A lot of these people went on to very long, very healthy careers.
Yeah, true. Of course, but still, at this point, they had it was all or nothing.
Yeah, but if they had lost, yeah, they would have been screwed. And some of the ones who died, it's like, well, yeah, Caesar Rodney was already dying. So the fact that he died a few years later was because he had cancer. Had nothing to do with the British. And the fact that Samuel Adams, I'm pretty sure, died a pauper has to do with the fact that Samuel Adams was a terrible businessman. He was one of the ones who made a living smuggling.
Yeah.
But this was it for them. This was the moment. The minute they put their name on that document, they have to win. Because where else are they going to go? No other European nation dared take them in. Even France could not have taken them in, because that would have meant war. And France was able to support the Americas, but it was never an actual declared war with England. And if they had taken in the revolutionary leaders, that would have been an act of war. So it's a do or die at this point. It's another one where I can mock them a lot. But the act of signing that document was one of incredible bravery. And a lot of them did go on to become soldiers or to hold positions of authority in the various colonial governments during the war. A lot of them were governors or members of Congress or what have you throughout the Revolution. The ones from New York, there was this whole thing where New York spent most of the war in British hands. So they're not just their lives, but their families' lives were in danger. And they still did it. And they still did it because they believed it was the right thing to do. So yeah, they were elites, and yeah, a lot of them were slave owners and what have you. But there is something admirable about all of these men.
Yep. So, overall, what's your opinion on this document?
For one thing, it's just beautifully written. There's a reason they picked Jefferson to write it. And not just the political reason, though God knows the political reason was important. But it's because, say what you want about the man, and I could, but my gods, he could write. It does, in its finished condition, show a few signs of having been edited by committee. But it is also an extremely well-crafted 5-paragraph essay, which is the convincing form of essay that you're taught to write in high school. You say what you're going to say, you say what you're saying, you say what you said. We have been wronged. Here is how we have been wronged. We have been wronged, and we're going to do something about it. Did it convince anyone outside the Americas? Did it convince anyone outside that room that the Declaration, that independence was a moral right for the Americas? I don't know.
Yeah, like you said, the Americans, most of them are like, okay, new leaders, whatever.
Yeah.
And then the European is like, oh, so we may or may not have no trade partner in a few years.
a lot of Parliament disliked the Americans intensely on every level. And there were some whose feeling on the subject was good riddance. And
Yeah.
most of them was let's kill all the traitors.
Yeah.
And there were a few who'd been on the side of independence from the beginning.
Yeah,
So,
I get.
you
Oh,
know.
I get not a joke, but really, Europe, some European countries were like, oh, so we can trade directly with America now and get their to go have to going through Britain
Mhm.
get their stuff. We can.
Yeah, exactly. Like we don't have to go through smugglers anymore. We can no hiding in dark coves off the coast you know, off the coast of New Jersey. We can just go into the port of New York. And that was quite the selling point, honestly. It did not take very long at all for European powers to start recognizing the Americas when they realized what a force for trade the Americas were going to be. Because the thing about North America in general, in the United States, and what it held at the time in particular is it's big.
Even,
There
even
are
yeah, even when it was just the 13, that's still.
there are more than a few individual colonies that are bigger than a fair few European countries. I
Yeah.
I would have to compare maps, but you look, I mean, sure, you get like Andorra and
Well,
whatever, but this is also
because
the
I think is
days
this. Sorry.
before a united Italy and a united Germany, so you get all those
Yeah.
little tiny pocket-sized countries all
Yeah.
over Europe.
At this point, we still have the the Holy Roman Empire.
The papal
Germany's not even a thing.
states. Yeah, like
Poland, Poland,
15 different German countries.
Poland may or may not be a thing at this point.
Who
You know,
even knows with Poland? Yeah. And so there's a lot of like this is a lot of land with a lot of resources, and even at the time it was mostly agrarian, but
and
that's
now
a
we went,
lot of farmland.
and now you don't have to go. We don't have to go through the British.
Right, exactly. And the British were adding tariffs when they were selling American goods on to other countries, which also the Americans weren't seeing any of. So, yeah, this was a very good financial windfall for a lot of European countries. So, nobody was exactly going to leap to the British defense, even though in the long run, revolutions are inspired by previous revolutions.
Yeah. So now we get to the more modern thing of this, where some people still use this for their problems today.
Mm-hmm. So, the first thing that's worth noting is the Declaration of Independence has absolutely no force of law in the United States whatsoever. This is not a law. We quote it a lot, and there are some parts of it that are our core national philosophy. The idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is, I would argue, a much stronger core national ideal than e pluribus unum is. Um, but the idea that when you have a problem, you write it down and present it to people is, I think, a much more powerful one than people realize. What occurred to me a few years ago is that the 4th of July is a holiday celebrating politicians. We don't think of it that way, but it is. The 4th of July is about people in a room trying to negotiate. And it is our most sacred national holiday.
Yeah.
It's another case of our not living up to our ideals, but what do you do?
I just forgot. I was I suppose I got holiday pay for when I had to work then.
Yeah, I think I got holiday pay for it once, but also Americans don't get holiday pay. So, yeah.
So I'm lucky I get Christmas off sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's a different topic.
Yes. Trying to explain all of this on a 4th of July weekend, actually, to my partner's sister's Swedish in-laws was a
Well,
lot of fun.
now you can just show them this video.
Right, exactly. But I feel like even though it doesn't have any force whatsoever in law, it does have force in what we believe about ourselves. We believe that we are the kind of people who produce documents like this when we need them, with basically no notice. We are the kind of people who can list in very clear terms what our problems are. We are the kind of people who can write beautiful, beautiful language about how much we hate tyrants. And yeah, we are going for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the thing that is most important to us. And there are, of course, all those other people who what they get out of it is so we should be able to overthrow the government anytime we don't like who got voted in.
What's what they try to do in the 1860s?
Yeah, well, not just the 1860s.
Well, that's like I said, that's what.
Yeah, but that was the thing, was they felt in 1860 that because the majority of the population was in the North, that the North was a new tyranny, and they ignored the part about how they did still have elected representation of their own. It was just that they were a minority, and sometimes you're in the minority and you don't get what you want. And that's a life lesson that your parents should have taught you.
Yeah, like I said, unlike British back then, they had, like you said, they had representation. They were just being slowly outnumbered. I guess outvoted.
Yeah. So, you're being outvoted doesn't mean you don't have representation.
And even then, like I said, the other thing is, at first they weren't even trying to eliminate slavery; it was just contain it.
Nobody, even in 1860, Lincoln was an abolitionist, but Lincoln was not saying, I am going to eliminate slavery. They just assumed that was the natural goal of any abolitionist president. He was like, I don't think I have the power to do that. Oh, you're giving it to me. Okay.
It's like, because they say because if they can't expand it anymore, eventually it will choke out. Like I heard things like it might have been dead already for the cotton gin.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, absolutely. The kind of cotton that grew well in the Americas is very sticky and holds on to the seed very tightly, and took an enormous amount of manpower to seed before the cotton gin was developed.
Yeah, most of the money crop was the tobacco. I think
tobacco, indigo, actually, which is the dye that blue jeans used. The blue that jeans are dyed is indigo, which is a plant native, I think, to India that was grown in the South. Some sugarcane, rice. Actually, a lot of slaves were from rice-growing parts of Africa and were imported specifically for their rice-growing abilities. So, yeah. But cotton wasn't a cash crop until the cotton gin. So, yeah, the idea that cotton would come along and extend slavery is kind of what created the Civil War as much as anything else did. But, anytime somebody gets angry at the government, this document gets hauled out. Rightly or wrongly. And honestly, I agree with the passive-aggressive statement on the Washington, D.C. license plate. Because if you look at the state of Washington, the situation, let's be clear on our terms here, the situation in Washington, D.C., they are under a lot of the rules of the colonies at the time. So are the United States territories.
Like Puerto Rico.
Like Puerto Rico, but the Virgin Islands,
Right.
Guam, the Mariana Islands. The United States has a lot of territories that never get brought up. And
Well, I think it's probably because at this point, most of the talking is that Puerto Rico and Washington D.C. are becoming states. At this,
well,
yeah,
yeah,
the other
Washington D.C. and Puerto Rico have the advantage of being close, and most of our other territories are somewhere in the middle of the Pacific and small.
Like Hawaii was for a long time.
Like Hawaii was for a long time. And there are a lot of native Hawaiians who do not accept statehood because their consent was not asked. Which is why things are so complicated in Puerto Rico right now, because they don't want a repeat of that.
But I think it's funny, some people don't even consider it, even though the same rights we do, they're still American citizens. Some people don't even recognize that. Like,
yeah,
why are we giving money to Puerto Rico for the hurricane? They're not Americans. I'm like, yes, they are.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, West Side Story, Puerto Rico's in America. My dad's sister married into a massive Puerto Rican family. And my uncle was one of something like 10 kids. And my aunt had 4 kids, and I think it's one of the smaller families of that generation. Huge, huge family. And they were all born United States citizens. 2 of my cousins married women from Puerto Rico. Their wives, United States citizens before they got married. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. But they don't have the same ability to set their own laws as the rest of the United States. They don't have the same say in federal laws as the rest of the United States.
They can't vote for president.
They can't vote for president. They don't control what military forces are there.
And they have no representation. They can send people like hi, can you do this? Like no, okay.
Yeah.
They're like suggestions.
And I mean, not to get super political, but how much did the failures of the United States government to take action after, what was it, Hurricane Maria? How much does that resemble the complaints about, he has refused his assent to laws and things of those lines? Like, Puerto Rico's got a lot of the same legitimate grievances as the colonies did. So, yeah. I'm sure so do a lot of the other territories. I don't know them as well, in part because I don't have family there. But, Guam and the Marianas and so forth probably also have a lot of these same problems, where they're not getting the attention from the U.S. government that they should, and that, according to the Declaration of Independence, is their natural right.
Like I said, legitimate complaints, not.
Yeah. Not, well, we don't pay taxes anyway, but you're making us pay taxes kind of thing. But the legitimate, we don't get to set our own judges kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not like I said, I don't like the president, so I'm going to storm the Capitol building.
Right. Like, you don't let us run our own state legislature. You don't let us appoint our own judges. You don't let us have any say in the House of Government where our laws are passed. Like, those are legitimate grievances, and the U.S. territories have those same legitimate grievances that our country talked about, I was actually born in 1976, so literally 200 years before I was born.
Were you born near before or after the 4th?
After December. But it still makes it really, really easy for me to do the math. It's like, oh, well, we're after, the 4th, but before my birthday. So on my next birthday, yeah. So 247 years ago, which is why I died a little inside when Dapper referred to something the other day as having been nearly half a century old, and it was from the year after I was born.
Yeah, I was talking, like I said, I was talking in their chat, about how the 70s show is now considered an old show now. I'm like, wow.
Yeah. Danny Masterson was born in the 70s, was on that 70s show, and will be getting out of prison when he's in his 70s.
So, a little sneak peek for our next episode, whenever that may be. It literally happens almost right after this, because the articles were written while the war's going on almost.
Yes.
But like I said, that's a story for another time.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think you want to do that one?
I'm good with next month. I'd have to check my calendar, but think I'm pretty open on Saturdays next month.
Cool. Like I said, the only thing I've scheduled for October right now is the 14th. We're going to be talking about Friday the 13th movie series on October the 14th.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, if I didn't work on Fridays, I'm like, why don't we do it on Friday the 13th?
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and I would have loved to have done this last month too, but the first 3 weekends in August, I'm in a field in these days in Monroe, Washington. So,
right. But next week we're going to go less historical and more scientific. We talk about the Guardians of the Galaxy. But thanks again for Jillian. Is that your name?
Yep.
For being on and sharing her historical knowledge with us.
Anytime.
But until then, we meet again. Never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. I'll see you next time.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Stand by me, werewolves!